Brilliant to be here. And we were asked to give a little bit of background about how we got together. And in fact, Peter and I, we both suffered in this laboratory as chemistry undergraduates doing inorganic practical work, which I do remember with particular kind of trepidation. We met in 1977. You were an undergraduate fresher, and I was the year above. We studied quantum mechanics with Alex McDermott. And then after a term, she said, Peter, don't bother to come back because you know more about this than I do. We kept on talking, and this is, I say, we were obsessed about time at the time and the way that physics was represented in it. And we ended up writing these 3 books together. And I think I'm going to hand over to Peter now just to talk about the kind of the intellectual thread that joins these 3 books, from Digital Twins to Complexity to The Hour of Time, which was a bestseller. Over to you, Peter.
Tricky to summarize these things in a hurry, because many people would say there's no connection between them, but there is, and it informs most of what goes on in the other 2 books from The Hour of Time. It's a big paradox in science and physics that we have different representations of time that are being used concurrently, but not necessarily consistently. The microscopic world follows time-symmetric laws. Thermodynamics is anything but time reversal symmetric. How do you match those up? How do you deal with a molecular world that knows no direction, whereas we do? And so all the way through this, the message is, in fact, that the concept of complexity is a kind of secret behind what makes things develop in irreversible directions, and the complexity of the things you can study goes with it. So inside the second book, if you open the covers, you'd find there's quite a lot of discussion of artificial intelligence, except it wasn't allowed to be called that at the time. That book was written in 1995, 96. But it discusses neural networks and other kinds of complexity. And now this is the trilogy completed. 2 years ago, we came back and wrote this book on digital or virtual you, and that's building this all from what may be mathematical and abstract ideas into something very real, which is a version of you that might be on a computer. And that's how they are kind of linked together.
Right, I'm going to use this microphone. Oops.
Sit down,
You can sit down, Peter, and I'm now going to gallop through. I'm going to give you a quick introduction to digital twins. So when I think about current medicine, I always get this picture in my mind of someone driving down the road, only they're looking in a rear view mirror the whole time. You know, you're a patient, you're trying to get the destination of good health, but your doctor is looking at trials done on people a bit like you, but not you, done in the past. In fact, maybe the road that you can see reflected isn't anything to do with the path you're going to take. And what the whole digital twin vision is to create a digital twin of the body, a multi-scale, multi-physics model that reproduces the way that the body works. And that means it's predictive, and that means it's personalized. And modern medicine is not predictive, roughly speaking, and it's not really very personalized either. You could take an AI and you could train it on population data, but you'd still end up with one-size-fits-all population medicine. And so, you know, this does have a tantalizing vision of changing the way that medicine works. And it's also got quite a long history. Digital twins is a phrase coined by NASA. Here I am in the Science Museum with Jim Lovell, the commander of Apollo 13. Apollo 13 is probably one of the most vivid examples of the use of a digital twin. We're actually been talking to the Smithsonian about acquiring this amazing digital twin. The command module of the Apollo spacecraft sat in the middle of this sort of nest of screens, and the astronauts could simulate every aspect of their flight to the moon. Now you can imagine when the spacecraft exploded most of the way to the moon, do you A, get the astronauts to play around with the spacecraft as it's sort of hurtling with failing power and so on, or do you play around with a digital twin on Earth to figure out how to safely power down systems? And of course, the Apollo digital twin played a really important role in saving Apollo 13. Now, the usual complaint about digital twins in medicine is it's all really complicated. My esteemed colleague Matthew Freeman, Roger, it's way too complicated, this stuff, and he's going to look at this and say, you haven't even mentioned the dark genome. You haven't got any idea of the complexity of the human body. And all I'd say is, look, I know that biologists love data, and here's a lovely satellite view of London. And imagine I set you a task. I want you to navigate around London. Now, I'm being rather unkind to biologists, but the standard response would be, we need more data. This isn't very high res. Let's get a really high res image of London right down to the last blade of grass. And that'll help you navigate more accurately. Or you can give them one of these. This is a simplified model of London. It's not perfect, but it's much easier to get around using one of these things. And it goes to the heart of the old joke about models, which is they're all wrong, but some are useful. And so just remember that with these digital twins, we're not trying to recapitulate everything in the body. We're just trying to recapitulate enough to do something useful and predictive. The other thing that gives us confidence is that there are massively elaborate computer models, physics-based models used routinely for forecasting storms and hurricanes and save lives. So we know that this approach can work and work pretty reliably as well. So let me just give you a few glimpses of the way that digital twin thinking is used in biomedicine. I mean, first of all, there's drug discovery, and that's something that Peter's the real expert on. You can investigate the way that an anti-cancer drug binds with a target in a body. You can actually come up with virtual breaths as well. So Dennis Dawley at Imperial and some of the guys at the Barcelona Supercomputing Center modeled breaths just to see, for example, if you're breathing in an inhaler, whether the drug's distributed the right way or where pollutants end up in the lungs and so on. One of the staggering things about the COVID pandemic was it took rather a long time for the WHO to figure out it was an airborne disease. So you can simulate the way that particles can be distributed around a busy or, ventilated, unventilated environment. Of course, we didn't call them digital twins, but the models that were used to predict how the pandemic would spin out were also an example of this approach. And I know there's a lot of controversy about the models used in the pandemic, but I'd still rather have a modeler at Imperial or the London Hygiene, Tropical Medicine or wherever in Edinburgh saying, these are the lockdown measures that should be the most effective than Boris Johnson making it up as he goes along. You can do sort of simple biomechanics simulations. So Marco Vicconti at the universities of Sheffield and Bologna has simulated muscles and skeletons. In fact, he's even animated them to the Macarena to look at the forces, in hips and so on. Michel Oyen at Washington University is looking at models of the uterus, and you can actually show that if you're doing a cesarean, a vertical cut introduces many higher stresses than a horizontal cut. So you can begin to understand something that surgeons already know, but you can also predict whether a patient is at risk of a uterine rupture and so on. If you come along to the Science Museum, you can find a big scale beating digital heart of Yasmin Aguado Sierra, who's an engineer working at the Barcelona Supercomputing Center. And she's taken an off-the-shelf digital twin model of heart called Alia Red. She's customized it with her own data, whether it's scans or looking at electrical activity of the heart and so on, and then simulated her own heart. And in fact, she also simulated it during pregnancy as well. So, it's an amazing pump, beats 100,000 times a day on average, and you can simulate that beat quite accurately. The kind of clever things you can do, though, with a digital twin is you can see the waves of electrical activity spreading over the heart to trigger a contraction, and then you can use a virtual heart to test whether drugs trigger arrhythmias. In Oxford, Blanca Rodriguez has done wonderful work showing that you can actually do more accurate tests on a human digital twin heart than you can on animal models, for example. And you can show various features of the heart. So you can see the muscle fibers, or you can see blood flows going through the heart. Each particle represents 400,000 red blood cells. And it's a healthy heart, which is good news for Yasmin. And in fact, she works with a bunch of people in LM, and they've got little virtual heart models. You can see if you visit their webpage, spin out from the supercomputing center in Barcelona. And just to make one general point, there are companies in this space, and digital twins are beginning to be accepted by regulators like the FDA as well. And even the kind of Everest of human digital twins is the brain. One element is something called the Human Brain Project. There's the virtual brain. And at Marseille University, they've used it to map out the higher level connectivity in the brains of patients who are undergoing epilepsy surgery. So it affects a lot of people. Only in desperate cases would you move from drugs to surgery. But obviously, you want to make sure that when you remove the zone in the brain that seems to be triggering the seizures, you want to minimize the damage. And so this kind of very simple digital twin can help plan those operations. One of the things that's really spurring progress in the field is computers are getting bigger and faster. We're now in the exascale era of 10 to the power 18 flops, a billion flops. Here's Frontier, one of a handful of exascale computers. Of course, the UK's blown it on the exascale front. That's something we could talk about. But this is something that Peter's been lucky to work on at Oak Ridge in Tennessee. And the kind of thing that Peter's done is he's taken data of Yoon's son, who was digitized, the 60,000 mile long network of her vessels, artery and veins. She's in the Visible Korean project, so she gave her body to medicine. She was digitized, and now Peter can actually simulate the way that blood moves through her vasculature, pressure, stress, and so on. Maybe you can start to track the movement of clots around the body. And of course, the next step would be to couple, this sort of arterial simulation with a digital heart. There are, of course, loads of ethical issues to think about: data protection, ownership, and so on. I've listed some of them here. I'm not going to read out the PowerPoint presentation, but just to say that, there will be some odd ethical issues that will come up. So what do we mean by someone who's healthy? So you might look at me now and say, Roger, you look really healthy, but my digital twin could be telling me that my 3 bottles of claret a day habit is going to reduce my lifespan by 10 years. So am I truly healthy? Have I got symptomless illness? There'll be interesting issues like that to arise. And I think now that's my quick tour to digital twins, and now over to my beloved co-author, who's going to take you into a couple of the big foundational issues around digital twins, digital pathology, and also AI. And we're doing the AI part just to drive Lionel mad, of course. Over to you.
Hello, I'm going to try and use this microphone so that I can move around a bit, because it seems we're not being democratic for the people at the back, and I hope I can advance the slides from a distance. What I want to do here is actually worry you about some of the things that people just assume because they're told it, and they're told these things by people who have power, influence, and money. And one of those things is artificial intelligence. So let's worry about that in a minute. But, one of the things that is fundamental here, if we're going to make life or death resolving decisions to do with humans, and you in particular, is can we trust computers? When can we trust them, when we can't? And this is a shocking slide, and it gets little traction because most people I know simply believe that if you put a problem on a computer, you believe the results. What is remarkable here is that if you deal with chaotic dynamical systems, which are actually an underlying theme through all our books, because the connection between the microscopic dynamics and equilibrium relies on the dynamical systems being chaotic. You have uncertainty in the initial conditions. You can't handle an exactly deterministic system, because if you push it hard enough, all the numbers that matter are irrational. The irrational numbers occur in far greater numbers than the real real numbers which are available on computers. And so if you think about it for a moment, what numerical systems you have on a computer? You have the floating point numbers every computer has, the IEEE standard, okay? So that's a very small portion of the rational numbers. It's a very finite amount of those. They're all actually dyadic numbers because it means they're divisible by 2. That's why they're in the binary system. But if you have a chaotic system, as I said, most of the initial conditions are actually irrational. Well, I can't study those on a computer. So we look at the most simple dynamical system that exists, for which we have an exact analytical solution. It's called the generalized Bernoulli map. Jacob Bernoulli created the version of this where the parameter beta in the map is 2 back 500 years ago. So it's just an iteration of x multiplied by 2 in this case, and then modulo 1 because it's confined to the unit line interval. And the remarkable thing about this is that we have a closed form solution for the distribution of the numbers you get if you iterate this thing indefinitely. And then you can do the test of looking at what the floating point numbers do for this problem. It's arguably the simplest dynamical system out. The generalized case allows that parameter beta to be other things than just 2. But the case beta equals 2 is a catastrophic failure, because with the rational numbers and the floating point numbers, if you take single precision, did you know that there's only 1 billion numbers between 0 and 1? There's another billion between 1 and infinity, and the same thing on the other side. So I've only got 1 billion numbers to play with in 0 and 1 versus the infinitude of the real numbers. So if you look at what the mathematical solution tells you versus the floating point solution, it turns out that for beta equals 2, it's catastrophically wrong, because you only have to consider the digital binary expansion of this thing multiplied by 2 shifts the numbers to the right and leaves 0. So after 23 iterations in a single precision number, you go to 0, x equals 0. And if you do it for the double precision number, you just wait twice as long to get the wrong result. So it's terribly wrong, because the true mathematical result is that it's uniform across the interval 0 to 1. This is embarrassing. And then you can look at other cases where beta is, say, a rational number, but not even integer, and you find that there are errors in the floating point calculation. So these errors are usually just not looked at. And when I talk about this in front of audiences, some people say exactly what I said earlier: don't worry. It's what the computer tells us is correct that we should worry about, not what the mathematical solution is. Because this is meant to be trying to capture the mathematical solution. So there are cases, the most trivial dynamical system which has chaos can't actually be calculated accurately in a digital computer. And this is afflicting potentially what we do with weather forecasting, which Roger showed earlier, and it's important in the human body as well. We don't know the initial conditions, and in a computer we can never get them correctly for the reasons I described earlier. We see the evolution of the system for very small changes goes in very different places, which is why weather forecasters need supercomputers, and they run large numbers of replicas of the order of 50 to 100 to get a probability distribution that tells us what the weather will be like tomorrow. They don't do one simulation. So that's ensembles, and Tim Palmer, who was working in atmospheric physics here for a long time, was the pioneer of that method. And in fact, what we're talking about here is the failure of digital computers to reliably predict some aspects of the real world, which is a significant concern. And this picture is actually going back to computers before the digital revolution that kicked in at World War II and beyond, when people used analog machines. Antikythera is one of the Greek mechanisms for predicting the positions of the celestial bodies, and all kinds of other systems used analog computers. They're interesting today because their energy requirements are almost zero, compared with what I'm coming on to in a minute, which is artificial intelligence, which has an insatiable demand for power, a level of power that we can hardly match. And you can see what I'm suggesting, that not all these predictions are going to be correct if you work with digital computers. But let's talk about artificial intelligence here, because Roger alluded to it earlier. If we're doing medicine and trying to predict your health in a general artificial intelligence model, we collect a lot of data on other people, and then we use other people's data to predict your health state. Of course, that's not really personalized medicine. And we need to just look at what it does and see whether we're happy with it, and then we can discuss it. So the idea is artificial intelligence does what our human brains do. Somehow we don't write down programs, we just intuit what we need to do, we learn it. And we repeatedly learn things and we can apply it to any area. So fundamentally, AI is a sort of form of pattern recognition. It classifies information as we're staying here. And I think it's useful to just look at one of the original cases of this, which kind of helped transform AI. In the era when I was writing with Roger, The Frontiers of Complexity, we couldn't talk about AI because we were in an AI winter. Then I woke up in 2010 and I found that I couldn't stop hearing people talk about AI. What happened between those? So what's happened is we've been able to look at larger quantities of data, process it more, but the image analysis one is a very good example of how it works. And you have to think of any AI system along these lines. And this is also rather an interesting account. And Kate Crawford's book, which you may have come across, called The Atlas of AI, I strongly recommend it to you. It's published in 2021, but it captures the problems that exist today as well. So if you try to create an image-based system, the idea is initially to distinguish humans from animals of various sorts and classify those based on the image. And then it becomes more ambitious and it thinks, well, I've got all these human faces, we can distinguish between them. What if I give attributes to the individuals? And if you look at how ImageNet was created, this is the power play that goes on in these systems. Some group of people set the system up and they define what the rules are. And whether this is scientific or not is the point I'm asking you to judge. Here, it's about, now we've got these people, and in the original version, there were precisely 2,832 subcategories. And I'm not going to read out what the subcategories are, because some of them are insulting or racist slurs or moral judgments that are made by the people who create the system. And then they want somebody to classify those faces, and they use sort of what Jeff Bezos called artificial intelligence, which means real people classifying lots of faces into the categories. And one of them here is being able to distinguish by facial appearance an assistant professor from an associate professor, for instance. There's no scientific foundation for that, but we can have a go at it. And you know what happens? An image has a huge amount of data in it, and I'm projecting it onto one thing. So there's nothing neutral about the way these systems are set up. There's an image selection issue which always interacts with the meaning of the words you want, and you've got bias in the system before you've even put any data into it. So it's not just data bias when I collect the data, it's the way it's organized. And this is the problem we get in healthcare, as we've already said, that you lead to bias and discrimination even when you create the system in the first place. And then you have to deal with the consequences of it. And actually, I think it was in March of last year, an expert panel reported to the NHS about the bias that was being spotted in medical device applications in the healthcare system, which typically don't work well for underrepresented groups and so on. And this part of it is clearly quite familiar, and the argument would be, I'll just put more people's data in, and in the end, it'll do a good job. That's the solution. But it's the problem we mentioned earlier, that actually, how much of this data are you going to try and get before you capture the individual? The idea of a digital twin is the opposite. It's to say, why don't we use your data to predict your behavior, not other people's data? And that immediately puts everyone on the same footing, regardless of race, religion, sex, creed, or anything else. I'm dealing with each person separately. I've been in India for about a month, bankrolled by British Council and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, promoting UK science and our wonderful country in India to collaborate with. And if I talk to Indians about how they deal with predicting people's medical situation using data, well, and this has happened in another country I was in just before I came back here today. They use Western data because that's the only data that's collected. So they're using, in India, Western data sets, which are already hopelessly overloaded in favor of male, white Caucasian males, to predict what's going on in an Indian population of such an immense complexity and heterogeneity that it can't be a serious proposition. So here are things about big data that I think I'd like to tell you. This is like what I'm calling for, and I wrote a paper, Roger was a co-author on it. It's called Big Data Need Big Theory Too, meaning we have to understand what we can deduce from data in general terms, such as when we study scientific problems, we have theories and theorems about the equations. What we need to be able to be sure of, because here's the biggest weakness of artificial intelligence, is I can't rely on the predictions. I can't be sure whether the predictions for some new case can be relied on, even if I've done training previously. Here's just one of the examples. Xiaoling Meng from Harvard, a distinguished statistician, has made a point of emphasizing we need to be able to have at least half, roughly speaking, of the data that you're going to be able to use to make predictions before you can make reliable predictions out of it. Which is why when we do AI systems, we get a data set, we divide it up, we have 80%, that's more than half, and we test it against 20%. And as long as it's a hermetically sealed case, it's going to work. The problem is when we go out into the real world, we might be sampling from a different distribution than the one we were looking at. So there's a weakness. Here's another one, and it's quite a hilarious case. After we put out the paper on big data need big theory, various people sent their works to me, and this is by two Italians. Their paper is really rather beautiful. It has a great quotation from Dante's Inferno at the front of it. And the main thing here is that they show, purely on the size of the data set, nothing to do with the kind of data that's in the data set, that as your data set increases in size, and my colleagues who do AI are always saying, let's give us more data, and then we'll fix the problems, like the bias. Well, no, in fact, the ratio of the spurious correlations, or the false ones to the true ones, just grows essentially like exponential in the size of the data set. So that's why you get scenarios such as are sort of made hilarious here in a website to do with spurious correlations. You find that you can see very nice correlations between people who died falling out of a wheelchair and the cost of potato chips, or people who drowned after falling out of a fishing boat. Correlates beautifully with marriage rates in Kentucky. That's the kind of thing you'll get in your large data sets. Far more of those than meaningful things. And how you distinguish between them isn't the business of AI, it's the business of science to unravel the correlations. So AI works in this way generically if we talk about the parametric methods, and I do want to talk. I think everyone here, I know Ruben I thought was just about AI, but I discovered that it covers all science and arts and humanities. So I hope there are people from all domains here. It's vital that we understand what's going on when we do design these systems. We have these networks, and the basis of them and their whole purpose is to find correlations, spurious or otherwise, between data you put into the system and the data that you get out of it, and you're trying to establish a correlation between these things. Now, that's where the equivalent of what I call Blake's dark satanic mills takes place in AI. We have to find those correlations, and we have to build networks that discover them. And that takes a lot of time and energy and effort, where we're changing the things round in a way that's not necessarily particularly enlightening until we find something that does the fix. And then we have a system that is in inference mode, capable of making predictions that are essentially instantaneous. And so this is the point I should come to here quickly around this, that in every one of these neural networks, you're overrun by parameters. The parameters between the pairs of neurons in your model. And the bigger the network is, the more those things proliferate. And you may or may not be familiar with this, and so I'll just display it to save time here. The proliferation of parameters in AI looks like this. If you do molecular modeling, and people do this, and you try to replace a potential of interaction between all the molecules in a system, you may have had 1,000 parameters in the model. By the time you've done machine learning, you've got 1,000,000. And those parameters are no longer physical, they are connection weights in the network designed to do the correlation. AlphaFold won a Nobel Prize last year. It's doing the primary sequence to the tertiary. It uses 1 billion parameters. I'm exaggerating, it's about 10 to the 7, 10 to the 8, in order to do the fit between the primary and the tertiary sequence. And large language models, of course, use 1 trillion parameters. You remember I said with the single floating point numbers, I've only got actually 4 billion to work with. So I've got more parameters in this game than I've got numbers if I use low precision. And so what's going wrong here is that I can't quantify the uncertainty on these systems in the way we know how to do uncertainty quantification on more sort of deterministic mathematical models. There are too many parameters. The parameters don't relate to something of direct meaning. And this is one of the things we need to fix with these models. Here's an example. If you're into MD, I know there are a few people here. My dear friend Phil Fowler is one of them. So I said the molecular dynamics guys who do an AI version of this produce 1,000,000 parameters. What we do is the opposite. We take a model that's got a few thousand in, and we apply uncertainty quantification methods to it, and we can actually show, in fact, that these histograms here show the parameters that actually influence the quantities we're interested in. These may be binding affinities to drug protein systems or materials properties. So we've actually reduced the number of parameters that we need to know, and each of them has an interpretable component. So the problem with AlphaFold is it'll reliably predict some structures which are close to what was trained on, but if I have a new primary sequence which is unlike the ones that are in the model, we can't reliably predict, say how reliable the predictions are. And this is the problem that we have to deal with in AI to make sure that it's nailed down. AI models, my colleagues at the Internet Institute here, that's the quote down at the bottom, do large language models have a legal duty to tell the truth? We know that, in fact, they are involved in decision-making in many areas. The question is, can we believe what the predictions are? And the problem typically is they're good at bullshitting. They produce answers that look good and may be good for some purposes, but when it comes down to science and accuracy, we have difficulty relying on them. And there's model collapse. Model collapse is shown here, which means if you populate the internet with AI-derived data and you iterate on it, your modeling just falls to pieces. This is a worrying situation. So situational and awareness about AGI, we think the large language models are so good that some of my colleagues like Leopold Aschenbrenner are telling us in 3 years we'll have gone beyond what's possible today. These systems will no longer just be learning all the books like the ones I've written and other people's and regurgitating them. They'll actually be able to generate theories, write down equations and solve them. That's what we're expected to do. The cost is astronomical in data, and we know that already. I mentioned earlier, Microsoft has now got on the move the reopening of the 3 Mile Island nuclear reactor to power its AI. This is because they require tens of gigawatts of energy to drive these systems. And the question here is, How can we justify such an extravagant outlay when we're not quite sure what the results mean? Here are the general limitations. I'm not going to go through all of them, but from a scientific point of view, they highlight why we're worried about some of the predictions that come out of these things, the problem that I mentioned earlier about not being sure of the certainty of the systems, the reproducibility is a problem, interpretability and explainability we've touched on, and ethical and security issues are also very widely concerning. So that's why it's good to see people like Lionel here talking about the concerns people in things like the creative arts have over using AI in an indiscriminate way to generate income for large companies at the expense of creative authors and writers. So these are the things that we need to do in order to get AI to really act convincingly in the context of digital twins. We can't put a digital twin with an AI in it because we can't be sure whether the predictions that come out of it are actually going to be reliable. We need to use theory. We need to integrate the computation, the big data, and the AI. AI needs to be informed about the laws of nature. Otherwise, it tends to make inaccurate results, predictions, some of them are hallucinations and so on. So the view we have here is that the field of AI is very important, but its impact is diminished if it doesn't work closely with the theory that's there to explain what's going on. That's what Roger and I in the Virtual Human book call Big AI. It's the fusion of AI with more of the scientific method. And I think with that, Roger, we're at the end. There's the book. It covers all of this stuff. A short plug that was published in March 2023. Okay, with that we can stop and thank you for your attention. Fish and tips time.